This did not begin with Ukraine. This did not begin with Crimea in 2014, nor with the color revolutions of the early 2000s, nor even with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. What we are witnessing now is a recurring pattern in great power politics, the reassertion of a declining empire against the encroachment of a rival system. History is familiar with this moment. We have seen this before in different costumes, speaking different languages, but following the same strategic logic. The Russian Federation under Putin inherited the carcass of a superpower. It retained nuclear weapons, permanent Security Council status, and vast geography, but it lost territory, influence, and the ideological magnetism that had once animated Soviet expansion. For 3 decades, Moscow watched the Western alliance expand eastward, not through conquest, but through the voluntary alignment of nations that preferred liberal democracy and market economics to Russian tutelage. This is intolerable to a state that understands power as zero-sum, and that measures its own significance by the extent of its sphere of influence. Putin is not testing limits out of ambition alone. He is testing them because the alternative, accepting permanent diminishment, is strategically unacceptable to the Russian state system itself. To understand what Russia is doing, one must first understand what Russia believes the West has already done. Moscow interprets NATO expansion not as the free choice of sovereign nations, but as the calculated encirclement of Russia by a hostile alliance. Whether this interpretation is accurate is irrelevant to the strategic calculation. What matters is that Moscow believes it and has organized its military doctrine around that belief. The West, meanwhile, operated on an assumption that proved historically naive, that integration into Western institutions would eventually mollify Russian assertiveness, that economic interdependence would create mutual interest in stability, that the rules-based international order, once established, would constrain great power competition. History suggests otherwise. Economic ties do not eliminate strategic rivalry when one party perceives existential threat. Integration into a Western-dominated system is not universally appealing to actors who remember themselves as great powers. Furthermore, the West assumed that Russian power was in permanent decline. The demographics, economic stagnation, and technological gaps would render Moscow incapable of serious challenge for decades. This was the assumption that allowed successive American administrations to focus elsewhere, on the Middle East, on counterterrorism, on the Pacific. It was the assumption that underpinned the decision to expand NATO without establishing any credible deterrent in Eastern Europe. This assumption has proven dangerously incomplete. From Moscow's perspective, the logic is straightforward and rational. If Russia does not establish clear red lines now, the process of Western encroachment will continue until NATO borders are on the Russian frontier, which they nearly are already. From this view, Ukraine is not a conquest but a preventive measure, not an expression of imperial nostalgia, but a strategic necessity to prevent an even more threatening future. This logic assumes several things: that the West will accept Russian dominance in its near abroad if the cost of challenging it is made sufficiently high, that Western resolve is softer than Russian resolve, that time is not necessarily on Russia's side, so action now, while Russian military capacity is still formidable, is preferable to delay, and that the Western alliance, lacking the cohesion and sacrifice that Russian state power demands, will eventually tire. These are not the calculations of a reckless actor. They are the calculations of a rational state attempting to manage its decline and preserve its status within a changing world order. The error is not in the logic itself, but in the assumptions about Western behavior that underpin it. Moscow may have miscalculated Western unity, American resolve, and the willingness of smaller nations to fight for their sovereignty, but the strategic impulse itself, to establish spheres of influence, to resist displacement, to test the boundaries of acceptable behavior, is as old as statecraft itself. This moment echoes the behavior of earlier declining powers facing displacement by ascending rivals. The Ottoman Empire, in its long decline, sought to preserve Ottoman territory and influence against European encroachment. It did so not through coherent grand strategy, but through a series of tactical interventions designed to slow the inevitable. It tested the limits of European tolerance repeatedly in the Balkans, in the Mediterranean, in North Africa. Each test taught Ottoman leaders something about where the Europeans would actually fight and where they would not. Some tests were successful. Others provoked responses that hastened Ottoman decline. The Austro-Hungarian Empire faced a similar crisis in the early 20th century. Surrounded by rising nationalisms and facing the prospect of permanent subordination within Europe, it sought to reassert control over its periphery, particularly the Balkans. It tested limits repeatedly. Annexing Bosnia in 1908, it discovered that the European great powers would tolerate certain acts and resist others. The system of testing and probing eventually led to Sarajevo and then to the collapse of the empire itself. The point is not that testing leads inevitably to disaster, but that such testing reveals the actual structure of power and tolerance in a system, often in ways the tester does not anticipate. More recently, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev engaged in precisely this pattern. Unable to compete with the West economically or technologically, it sought to expand influence through military means, proxy conflicts, and spheres of influence. It tested limits in Angola, in Afghanistan, and Central America. For a time, these tests seemed successful, but they revealed something crucial: that American resolve, though sometimes dormant, was not absent, and that the costs of perpetual expansion eventually exceeded the benefits. The Soviet state exhausted itself, and when a declining power begins to test the limits of the established order, several consequences typically follow. The first is clarification. The declining power learns through test and response where the actual boundaries are. Sometimes these boundaries are further out than expected. Sometimes they are nearer. The clarity itself, however, is valuable to both parties. They understand what the other will and will not tolerate. The second consequence is entrenchment. The rising power, or the coalition opposing the declining power, typically responds to aggression by consolidating its position. NATO is now more cohesive than it has been in 3 decades. It is spending more on defense. It is expanding. It is moving military assets closer to Russian borders. Each Russian test strengthens the alliance it feared. This is not a new pattern. It is the typical response of a threatened system. The third consequence is exhaustion. Testing limits is expensive. It diverts resources from domestic priorities. It invokes economic sanctions, isolation, and external pressure. Over time, the burden of maintaining a posture of perpetual assertion falls on the society attempting it. The society must either find victories that justify the cost, or it must gradually retrench. History suggests that retrenchment usually comes not through deliberate choice, but through the slow accumulation of costs that eventually exceed benefit. The fourth consequence is systemic instability. When a great power begins to move outside the established rules in pursuit of spheres of influence, it raises the question for every other actor: why should I follow the rules either? The breakdown of norms, the notion that conquest is unacceptable, that borders should be respected, that international law matters, does not benefit the declining power. It benefits the strongest actor in an anarchic system. That is typically not the one attempting the comeback. This is not to say that Russian testing will cease or that further moves are unlikely. A state that believes its vital interests are threatened will continue to act until it learns through costly experience that the cost of action exceeds the benefit. That lesson usually comes through military defeat, diplomatic isolation, or economic exhaustion, or some combination thereof. It does not come through reasoned argument or appeals to the rules-based order. The declining power does not believe in rules that ensure its decline. What usually follows is a long period of maneuvering, posturing, and tactical probes. The outcome depends on factors that are partly contingent on the skill of diplomacy, on the tolerance of the rising power, on the capacity of the declining power to absorb costs, on the reactions of smaller states caught between them. These factors cannot be predicted with precision, but the trajectory can be discerned toward either some form of negotiated arrangement in which the declining power accepts a reduced role, or toward repeated crises that continue to weaken it. The problem for Russia is that each test, each assertion, each move to recover lost sphere of influence strengthens the very coalition Moscow fears most. Each invasion of a neighboring country demonstrates the necessity of NATO to those on NATO's border. Each act of military aggression justifies increased defense spending among Western nations that would otherwise prefer to focus on internal challenges. Russia, in asserting its power, is accelerating its own encirclement. This is not unprecedented. That is what makes it genuinely dangerous. We have seen great powers attempt to manage their decline through assertion and dominance. We have seen them test the limits of what rivals will tolerate. We have seen some of them succeed temporarily in preserving their status through such means, and we have seen all of them eventually pay the price for miscalculating the tolerance and resolve of those who stood opposed to them. History has already written this chapter. The only question is how long it will take to unfold, and what collateral damage will accumulate before the lesson becomes clear. The answer to that question depends not on Moscow's intentions, but on the decisions made by those with the power to either accommodate or resist Russia's claims. For now, the pattern is set. The testing will continue, the responses will intensify, and the space for compromise will gradually shrink, not because anyone wished it to, but because that is what happens when declining powers pursue restoration through means that rising powers cannot permit. This did not begin today, and it will not end tomorrow.